for joining us in today's APF Friends of Foresight Office Shock. Just a few reminders before we get started. We encourage you to keep your cameras on so that you can ask your questions. If everybody would like, we can take a group photo at the end or before the start of the program. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded after the event. So please be reminded that by turning on your video, you are consenting to be recorded. And lastly, kindly rename yourself so that we can easily identify you. There will be a question and answer portion towards the end of the program. And before we begin and before I introduce our guests for today, we would like to invite you to the Association of Professional Futurists 20th Anniversary Celebration, which will be held on April 28 to 29 at the Museum of the Future in Dubai at the United Arab Emirates. So if you'd like to join, we have pasted in the chat box the link for you to register. You can also scan the QR code that you see on screen. So let's get started, everybody. It's my honor to introduce to us very briefly our special guests for today. We have Rebecca Ryan, professional futurist and economist. Hello, Rebecca. Thank you for...
Hello. It's so nice to be with you all. Thank you.
So great to have you with us, Rebecca. Next, we have Dr. Charlie Grantham, a teacher at the Community Design Institute. Good morning, Charlie. Thank you for joining us so early. It should be about 5 a.m. where you are.
That's so fine. I have coffee. I'm looking forward to it. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you, Charlie. And we also have Sherman Cruz, the chairperson of the Association of Professional Futurists. Hello, Sherman. Oh, we can't hear you, Sherman. I think your microphone might be...
I'm sorry about that.
There. No problem. Thank you, Sherman, for joining us today. And lastly, we have with us Dr. Joseph Press, a futures architect at the Institute for the Future, and also one of the co-authors of the book Office Shock. Thank you so much, Joseph, for helping us put together this Friends of Foresight event. So that is our esteemed panel of guests for today. And please allow me to turn this over to Joseph so we start our program.
Well, thank you, Nicole.
Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you so much, Rebecca, Charlie, and Sherman. I'm really excited to really have a conversation amongst Friends of Foresight and using the new book, Office Shock, as a platform for us to talk about how is applied foresight happening in specifically the corporate community, the business community. So for today's conversation, I want to give just a bit of a backstory on forecasting the future workplace in the book Office Shock. Share a little bit about my co-authors, Bob Johansson, who I think many of you known, and I put him as a mentor that I've learned so much from. In addition to Christine Bullen, my other co-author, we really do see ourselves as architects of the future. And you'll see on the right-hand side there the image from our windows in Palo Alto with the Buckminster Fuller statement that we really do need to think about architecting the future differently so that we are not its victims. And we really think that the Office Shock experience, the writing of this book, has some insights for how we might apply foresight in the corporate community with the specific intention of helping to accelerate the transition of the corporate community to more sustainable practices. And we'll talk about that. And then I'm really excited that we'll be able to talk some shop and just share our lessons learned from the field in applying foresight in this environment. So with that, let's jump in. So a little bit of a backstory. We had the opportunity to connect with a global furniture company called USM, actually based in Switzerland, through a connection that Bob had with BDG Architects. And BDG architects, and I'm actually at a conference now, that's why I was a little bit late, with Colin McCready. He is the chief creative officer of BDG. And when USM, the furniture company, started thinking about, well, what is the future of the workplace? Colin had the foresight to bring Bob in and the Institute for the Future. And because I have actually a architectural background, Bob asked me to join the team. And when we began having conversations with USM, the CEO of USM was really interested in not just having another forecast, but to stimulate a broader conversation about the future of working and living. And so that from the beginning was already a different kind of mandate from a client for a strategic forecast. Now, what we ended up deciding to do was, because Bob has published many books, and the last, I believe, 6 or 7 of them have been with Barrett Kohler Publishers. Barrett Kohler, and you can see perhaps their tagline below, connecting people and ideas to create a world that works for all. They are a B Corp, and they're really a leading publisher of books that are focusing on a different kind of leadership, future leadership. And again, in the spirit of helping organizations transition to a better world. This had a real influence on our writing of the book, and specifically Steve Prasanti, who has been Bob's editor. He was the chief editor at Barrett Kohler. He was fundamental in helping us take our methods and approach of strategic foresight and create 2 aspects that were really important for applying foresight on the future of the work and workplace. Number 1, he talked about the importance of having a horizontal narrative, so a very clear structure that would help guide the reader through this forecast, which turned into a book. And then secondly, he talked about the importance of having a vertical narrative that would be a framework that would also help the reader to not only make sense of the future workplace, but also give them a framework that they would be able to take into their own organizations, so that the book was not just a forecast on the future of work in the workplace, but it was also a call to action. And that was very much in the spirit of Barrett Kohler's mission. It was also in the spirit of USM's intention. And for the Institute for the Future, our mission has always been, for over 50 years, to help make the world future ready by spreading strategic foresight. And hopefully many of you have had the opportunity to interact with IFTF. So you can already see here that the backstory brought together these 3 different organizations with a similar mission. And clearly that had a fundamental influence on the way that we did our research and we wrote the book. And you can see here that the book has 3 parts. So very much in the spirit of what Steve had asked us to do, to have a narrative, a horizontal narrative to guide us through the book. We then took the Institute for the Future's approach to foresight, which is foresight, insight, action. And because our target was a corporate audience, we did a bit of more of a call to action. I think in many ways, a bit of a simplification, but it was more of a call to action so that, again, our readers, particularly within the corporate audience, would be able to pick up the book and say, oh, okay, I can actually apply this in my organization. And asking these questions, what future, what next, what now, really created a very strong pull through the book. And you can see here that we always reference the Institute for the Future's approach of foresight, insight, action. And we were also very explicit about the storytelling at each step of the way. And the storytelling for Foresight, we actually had the opportunity to have young underrepresented artists actually illustrate the story of what future. We created in part 2 these spectrums of choices that were informed by signals that we did research on to trigger insights about what might be the experiences of that future. And that was really the core of what next. And then the call to action on what now. Here we focused on the actual recommendations of what organizations and leaders and also communities might consider in the way of applying what we call future back thinking to create better futures for working and living. So I mentioned part 1, what future, and the illustrations that we brought to life, our scenarios. So scenarios still a very important way of describing or telling a story about a future, but we were very explicit about ways to illustrate that, to visualize that future. And at the end of each of the illustrations introducing each of these spectrums of choice, we also had this call to action. How might you illustrate your future with more purpose, with more better outcomes, our second spectrum, with an impact on the climate, to increase belonging, to raise the augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence, making better decisions, making our biases more transparent. We also had the opportunity to create a new word, the office verse, to describe place and time. And then our last spectrum, the 7th out of the 7, is about agility and referencing what Bob had always referred to as shape-shifting organization. So you can see here part 1, what future, telling stories, illustrating the stories all around our vertical narrative, these spectrum of choices. And to help organize, again, making this a more actionable forecast, we included this idea of a mixing board as a way to visualize the choices. And these choices were all about crossing the range of options, what we called a spectrum of choice. And this was really inspired by Bob Johansson's previous book called Full Spectrum Thinking. So not only were we applying strategic foresight to the future of the workplace, but we were also applying Bob's really profound insights about future leadership and how to lead organizations in the future, and the choices to be made now, the actions, not binary, but to be able to have clarity about what are the range of choices, and to have clarity about the importance of synchronizing choices, which was the outcome of what we are using more and more, surveys, just a quick kind of a pulse survey, and this is just an example of one that we used recently, to be able to help people understand what is the level of synchronization. And in this example, you can see here that we're referring to our 5th spectrum of augmentation. And you can see in this example that there's a wide range of choices, of attitudes, of ways that an organization might think about balancing human capabilities with technology capabilities. And clearly this is a very timely topic because of the introduction everywhere of AI with GPT-4 coming out. And then the last part of the book, that what now, we included a quick start guide, again, with our intention of helping organizations apply future back thinking to begin or to trigger a intention to make a better future for working and living. So that's a real quick overview of the book. And there were a couple of insights that in preparing for this conversation, I'd like to offer. And then I'm really excited to hear from Rebecca, Charlie, and Sherman. What insights do we have that you have from applying foresight in a corporate context in an environment that clearly requires accelerating change? And those were really, I think there was a timely topic of the future of the workplace triggered by the pandemic. So many organizations were asking, do we go back to the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week? Or are we in the home office 3 days a week and at the office 2 days a week? But that was just the trigger for us to then broaden the conversation, broaden the thinking to be more systemic, very much in the spirit of a steep analysis. And that was where we developed this vertical framework, the mixing board, the spectrum of choices of office shock. So that was, I think, one real interesting inflection point that was captured in the book. The second, as I mentioned, simplifying our method by calling it future back thinking, but it being very, very rooted in 55 years of practicing and applying strategic foresight at the Institute for the Future with our Foresight Insight Action cycle, but thinking about our audience and to make it something that would be more tangible and be a bit more compelling to actually put this into practice, not only for the futures work, but ideally encouraging the organization to go into the what next, and then to get them also to go to the what now. The third point that became very interesting was the power of story making. And the illustrations that we included in each of the chapters on our spectrums is an example of encouraging co-creation. And what we have been finding recently is that that invitation to co-create a story, to make a story, is just augmented through artificial intelligence. And so we've been experimenting with large groups to have people put in prompts, create illustrations, and then to converge on a shared image of what future. And that has been very instrumental in facilitating conversations and, most importantly, choices about these spectrums, which we know are going to be essential if we are going to mobilize people for collective change, if we are to mobilize organizations to make some of the hard choices that will have a positive impact on the planet, that will increase belonging, that will leverage technology in a way that will benefit humanity, and ideally also build a collective purpose, and hopefully, which will also then deliver on the important spectrum of more prosperity to help organizations move up those mixing board across those 7 topics. So that is a real brief summary of the book, some of the insights that I think certainly for myself, I think Bob and Chris as well, had in applying foresight in this context. And I'm hoping that that's going to trigger some thought through and trigger some thought, some conversation about what can we learn about applying foresight in a corporate setting, given the importance of helping transition to a more sustainable future.
Yes, if I may go first, Joseph, regarding applying foresight, at least in the context of the corporate, let me just brought in some sort of a lens from a risk management perspective. Before the pandemic, like 5 years before it actually occurred, several companies which I was a part of has been simulating shocks and then assessing its implication to the workplace, and not just the workplace, but to working and living in the office. And then the scenarios that were introduced to facilitate this simulation to reduce the shock, especially when these shocks are externally driven, or perhaps cyber or digital or natural or man-made, the scenarios were pretty quite conservative in a sense that it ensures that it does not really disrupt the decision maker. And second is that it did not create panic. Now, the intent of the workplace, of the office, was to replicate the function if it is disrupted, not necessarily everywhere or anywhere, but two emerging two at least two places in mind. One is the alternate site, right? Replicate the exact function of the work, the resources, and the ability of the people to move from one site to another. And the third site, which is the third option, the last option, if everything gets worse, is our home. And primarily the intent, the narrative before the pandemic was just the function of the office replicated anywhere. There is no conversation about belongingness. There's no conversation about agility. There's no conversation about purpose. So it's just about you as a worker and as a member of the company to replicate the function of what you actually do in the context of ensuring that productivity and efficiency are not sacrificed or compromised in the office. So I'm going to stop at that, just some sort of provocation. The narrative was just about the function.
If I may, just a quick one, Chairman. That's a fabulous description of the real office shock. It's shocking that functional assumption. And it happened for all the reasons that you mentioned, including social inequality, including economic inequalities, including bank crises, including the specter of war that's happening now or potentially happening in other areas in the world. As we speak, we see it happening. So I think all of that is triggering that opportunity to shock the office and to think differently about the assumption of, as you described, functionality. And the futures are really the way to then give the future back thinking, and futures and strategic foresight provides the space to explore how might we turn that shock into a great opportunity to address some of the more fundamental systemic issues that the functionality are just a symptom of. Sorry, Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Sherman and Joseph and Charlie. And it's so wonderful to be with the 95 of you who are here live. And for those of you who I hope watch this and we keep this conversation rolling. You touched on it briefly in the book, but one of the things that I have found frustrating is that the conversation about return to office has felt like a distraction, almost like the frosting underneath the cake, which gets at deeper issues. And I think your mixing board does a nice job of touching on what some of those issues are. But the fundamental one, I call them like the root questions, is, why do we exist in the first place? You know, why does our company exist in the first place? And how do we actually create value? On the corporate side, right? That's the people who buy our stuff and happily give us money. But I work a lot in the public sector and the public adjacent sector. And it's like, you know, why should we earn residents' trust? And when to me, it's like form follows function, right? You're an architect. And it's like, if we start getting those questions right, why do we exist? So on your mixing board, this would be like our purpose and membership and, you know, a sense of belonging. I think the reason that we focused on return to office is because we feel uncomfortable having those deeper conversations. And yet those are exactly the conversations that we as workers had. Faced with an existential crisis, I might die, we said, how do I want to spend my time? And I feel like this is the place where most organizations have just missed it. They're so focused on the frosting of how are we going to work in the future? Where are we going to work in the future? And they're not asking the deeper questions, which, if really answered, would resonate with all employees or with the right employees and would help you figure out, you know, where and how you work, whether that's in the office or in some other configuration. So that's my only reflection after reading the Office Shock book. And I do want to just put one question into the mix, and that is, why office verse instead of work verse? You know, because the office is a place, but work is what we do. And I just found myself asking that again and again. Over.
Yeah, Charlie.
Charlie, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. When I read the book, first of all, it was like a trip down memory lane. I can remember those conversations with Bob. I can remember those conversations with Frank Duffy and what have you. And I'd like to play off of what Rebecca just asked. And I'm going to date myself with this one, but way back when, I can remember talking to corporate people about why they needed to buy a desk. And the answer was, well, we need something to put the telephone on. Okay. So fast forward now, what Rebecca said, you know, what's an office? Or better yet, why an office? I think we need to drill back to that question. The past 3 years, a lot of people said, I don't know, maybe that's just one option, but what's option B and C? And I just love the way you folks put out that mixing board. I got to say that because I'm a design kind of guy and I do visuals, and I can't wait to take that idea and get in front of a group of people who are trying to create their new, in your term, office verse, and use those 7 dimensions. I mean, that's going to be exciting. So, you know, thanks for bringing that to us. Okay.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, Charlie. And Bob sent his warm regards, and it's amazing, you know, that the Frank Duffy experiences as well, because those are the questions. And I think Rebecca did a great job of summarizing, you know, why are we here? And we tried to capture that with the first spectrum of choice, because you can fulfill your purpose as an individual, or you can fulfill your purpose as a collective. And depending on where you are in your life, in your career, you're going to be looking for, you know, the balance and finding ways to, you know, to amplify either more individual purpose or more collective purpose. And that's really okay. And we really did, as you said, Charlie, try to create something that would give everyone that systemic, holistic view, but do it in a way that was not trying to be prescriptive, but really opening up conversations. And if I may, Rebecca, your question about, you know, why the office first, on the one hand, and the frosting. So we have definitely heard from too many of the organizations that have said, hey, yeah, we're interested in Office Shock, but we've already got a workplace policy. We have really good people that have identified what's the right balance between home office and working in an office building. And to be quite honest, we have been a bit challenged to say, hey, that's great. You've got spectrum number 6 taken care of, the place and time, but there are 6 others.
Right.
And there are some organizations and there are some leaders that do see this as an opportunity to address those other spectrums of choice, but there are many that aren't there. So I think it's something that we all need to, try to work on, whether we are architects or futurists or designers of digital experiences, to always try to encourage, to broaden the thinking, broaden the conversation. Because, hey, if we don't do it now, as we saw with the IPCC report, we are all going to be in trouble very, very soon. And that's not, something that's going to be in the future, but it's already happening now in many of the locations that we are. So I think all very good input. I see Timothy has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a timely and perennial topic. I taught a graduate level course on the end of work in 1995. So I've been at this for 28 years. It was based on the work of Jeremy Rifkin and Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book on the age of the smart machine. And I'll keep this to two questions. One is, how do we deal with the alienation of digital labor? Because it's a highly alienating problem. Shoshana Zuboff summarized it in her case study of a paper pulp plant, which are very smelly operations. If anybody's been around a paper mill, they'll know what I mean. And the workers, though, identified with the smell. And when they were taken into a digitized workspace with airlocks, they broke the doors so that the smell could come into them, even as they were sitting at screens instead of being at the actual job site. So we have that alienation of digital labor, which I think is a here and now problem and only getting worse. My second question has to do, again, fundamentally with what work is. And maybe you can address this, being, for me, over time, I've realized that work is ultimately, I think, going towards the expression of self. And how do we transform what we engage in as work into that expression of self? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, Joseph, if I could quickly respond to that and then at least build on all of your ideas, Rebecca, Charles, and Joseph, is that, of course, embarking from the framework that you just shared with us is the question, does your future self need an office? Right? Does your future self even need an office? That is a question. And second is that when I was trying to read the book, in the chapter wherein it discussed, not just it's the office in the corporate context, but in the context of the societal, the structural, in the context of power. And then I was wondering, how the word office has evolved in the last 200 years. And what I learned is that office was a word that was coined in the 17th century by the French. And the meaning of office back then was closely related to the idea of power. Right? And it meant position. Office meant position. And rather than workplace. The idea of the office as a workplace, I learned when I did some literature review, is just a contemporary invention that was introduced early in the 19th century, from position to the workplace. Now, what I understood was that if office is interpreted in the context of position, is that the purpose really is to bring legitimacy of the function that a person in the office. But that would change and be challenged eventually. And they would see, of course, that offices as well has a ceremonial value, not just the function, but it is symbolic in terms of power. And then the office would eventually influence the way we do work, which is, of course, 8 hours, right? Like you're boxed in the office working for 8 hours. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that going back at least to the context of the book, is that if the meaning of offices evolved from position to workplace, and then the question is what's next. And then going back to the provocation of Timothy, about incorporating the conversation when it comes to the digital world. Have you watched? I think they just released it on Prime Video. It's called The Consultant. Perhaps try to watch that, and then perhaps that could answer Timothy's question about the digital and the office. I'm going to stop there. Sorry.
Well, you're really onto something there, Sherman, and Timothy, to kind of get to your point. I've been doing a lot of anthropological work, looking at ancient cultures in the past couple of years, and there's never found an office in a village, in an indigenous village. Strange thing, isn't it? So I'm thinking if we go, forward, maybe that's where we're going. We're going back to the future, pardon the phrase there, but I really do think that's where it's headed, and it's going to be much more centered on this idea of, you call it belonging and around community, because we're humans, we're social animals, and we've learned in the past couple of years. You got your laptop and your cell phone, you can be anywhere and play with those symbols and send things around. But being physically co-present with people is really the driver. And I'm sorry, I'll turn the rant machine off, but that's my response.
No, I think it's very interesting, the anthropological aspects. And just a quick one, Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you. We tried to capture that shift by introducing the word officing. Now, we didn't trademark it. That's not our business. It might not stick, but the real meaning, and I think this is, Chairman, also what you were describing, the real meaning of humans coming together to interact. That's really what is special about the office as a place not only of work, but a place of convening, a place of interacting, a place of interacting and building simpatico, building that synchronization that we talk about in the book. And I do think, Timothy, you're asking a great question. How will that be replicated in the digital environment? Certainly for the generation of people who have enjoyed that sense of officing, the meaning, the smell of the plant, that shift is a shock, and that shock is very painful. We do write about in the book the next generation that is growing up with online gaming, for example, where esports, World of Warcraft, where they're actually used to interacting in a digital environment, but they're still getting that synchronization, they're still getting that social interaction. And how might that evolve? We don't know. And that was why we, a bit tongue-in-cheek, called it the Office Verse. Rebecca, a little bit of an inspiration from the metaverse, but I think much more about the multiverse and the different places, not only where we work, but also the different places that we live and the different lives that we have, very much in the spirit of everything, everywhere, all at once. And that was kind of what we were trying to bring in, again, to the corporate world, using that keyword office to be able to ideally get leaders in organizations' attention.
I'd love to add something. So I am literally in the car, Central Standard Time, driving my kids around while I listen to this Zoom. And so when we define office, I'm very aware of the fact that for me, it's totally changed, but I call myself a Gen Z advocate. I'm spending a lot of time with Gen Z, understanding what they want from the office. My company is building what they call collaboration centers, right? They're not calling them new office buildings. They're calling them collaboration centers because the definition of the purpose that the office serves has changed. As your book talks about, like the purpose of even physical space has changed. But with the rise of generative AI, internally, I'm involved in some of our responsible AI and generative AI initiatives. The nature of work has changed. And it's challenging in the enterprise environment because the investments people are making right now in real estate are going to last 20 years. And so being able to influence that has been very interesting and challenging, but I salute entities that are looking at the physical office space in a different way, honestly. But that, just the fact that I'm taking this call in my car, I thought I'd call that out.
Yeah, that's your office first. Well, thank you, Annie, for sharing that. Rebecca, I cut you off, so I wanted to hear what you wanted to say.
Well,
That was
there's Annie, I think, you know, this is Annie's example is actually an excellent example of the preponderance of pressure we put on family systems to first have to drive your kids several different places, then show up at work. Spending time in traffic is the thing that's most injurious to people's happiness on a daily basis. And then having to do that all over again. So Annie, I feel like you are like at the nexus of sort of the bullshit of commuting to work and how that pollutes the human experience, but also your research, I think, is fascinating. And I want to actually turn over to the chat because people are just lighting it up in the chat, and let's bring them into the conversation. Number one, there's like a dialogue going on about generations at work, and if generations at work really do value different things. And I will say this feels like a very Western, American-centric, European-centric, where we're hanging our hat of identity on where we work, not how we live, which, you know, I think is a seismic shift in America as well. The country that invented workaholism had the Great Resignation, where millions of people for many months left. It goes to that existential crisis. But we're also talking about productivity and, you know, the need to actually make a difference in the world and how we shift or flip that conversation. We know, for example, that, you know, in the UK, there's been experiments with 4-day work weeks, and Singapore asked all of its, you know, all of its public employees to take 1 day a week to help tend public gardens. In part, that was a hedge against the drought and the famine that they were expecting. But we are really like experimenting with how AIs get brought in as a signal. For example, one of the things in the chat is that there is an AI that's running a closed caption on this. I've never been in a meeting where an AI introduced themselves and said, we're running a closed caption. So I think there are a couple things here: generational differences, economic versus purpose, and the AI piece. And I know that all of these are sliders on your, you know, your magical dashboard, but would love to hear from Sherman, from Charlie, from you, Joseph, about your responses to any of those three things. Over.
Yeah, just quickly, perhaps not a response, but just to add on what those that were mentioned. There was a report done by the Millennium Project, I think several years ago, and in one of the scenarios that they have about the Work Technology Report 2050 is the emergence of new craftsmanship, right? Because there are a lot of emerging things going on, and if you try to combine them, you know, it's really plural, so heterogeneous. It's creating a new type of skill set, which perhaps we're not yet aware of, you know, or might not necessarily be on our radar at the moment. So that might also, you know, some sort of drive new nature and function and repurposing of what we mean in terms of office. You know, I've seen a lot of conversation about the relational aspect that you build when you try to design an office, if that is the context and purpose, belongingness. But then you also have new craftsmanships. Like, for example, I think this has been accentuated by Bob Joseph in his book, The Full Spectrum Thinking, gamification. You know, and gamification, gamers is evolving, creating, producing new types of skill sets. They are more global, they're more fast. You know, the learning curve is so fast, they can learn things so fast. You know. Like I couldn't even like play the games now that my kids are playing, in fact, because it's so fast. There's so much speed going on. Yeah.
I'd jump in on that, Sherman. I just heard of a new job description the other day called a query engineer. This is a person whose job it is to figure out how to ask the AI platforms questions. Hundreds of thousands of dollars to be a query engineer. But let me use that to jump in this whole idea of technology. And Joseph, your idea of the slider about augmentation, I absolutely see that. It's not a replacement, it is an augmentation. And I would submit that what we're seeing today, all of the media hype aside, but all of the generative AI, as it's called, is really what I'd call in a larval stage. It's, getting ready to go into the cocoon, but we don't have any idea what the butterfly is really going to look like when it comes out the other side. So, we need to have some patience and not go too nuts. And I'll be very anxious to see what the AI stream running in the background is doing after we're done with this, if we can go back and ask it to summarize the 4 key points that were brought up during this presentation. Can somebody do that?
Yes, it'll be interesting to see their reaction. And I think, Charlie, you're addressing something that's so important for us as practicing, foresight practitioners. I think we've got a unique opportunity to be able to, influence or to frame the conversation or the question: how might AI augment our collective intelligence for the better? Similarly to what you also spoke about, Rebecca and Annie as well, as strategic foresight practitioners, we've got a unique opportunity and responsibility to be able to raise the question: what are the more equitable business models? What are the more systems that don't continue to reinforce the systemic or racial inequalities, the gender inequalities, the insanity of workaholism? So as futurists, we've got an opportunity to ask the question, okay, 10 years out, what would you like? Either a member of a community, a leader in an organization, and Sherman, you mentioned, our future selves. What do we want? What are some of the choices that we want to make? So that was also how we were trying to apply foresight, to be able to be future ready, to be in front of these questions that we don't know what the answers are going to be. But if we're able to ask those questions and trigger the conversations, we may, for example, Charlie, be able to shape the butterfly that comes out, or at least try to influence it into a world that we prefer it to be, a desirable world. So it's not just provocative, but it's also a preferred world. And I think that's what we tried to do with the book, to get in front of those questions.
Well, I think you're presenting an opportunity for people to intentionally design the workplaces, and I do-it-yourself workplaces. So, here's a kit of parts, figure it out what works best, and you're not going to get it right the first time. So, fail and go back and go through an iterative process. But you're presenting a framework for people to start thinking about it. It's much, much deeper than most folks in the corporate officing world are using today. I run into the same thing you're thinking about. Oh, we've got a plan. We're going to do this and that. Well, what were the first questions that you asked to start that? Well, we didn't ask any questions. We just are looking to drive efficiency, and get the quit rate down. Other than that, no, okay.
Yeah.
I'm in violent agreement with you. Thank you.
Timothy's got his hand up again.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to piggyback on this conversation. One deals with, at a very fundamental level, and I've just reviewed a book by Jim Dater on identity. So I think key to this and foundational is, who are us anyway? You mentioned workaholism, and that tends to be the identifying fixture, again, in the American and by extension, Western identity. What do we do? As opposed to, and I've lived 12 years in Hawaii, in Native Hawaiian culture, the first questions are not what do you do, but who are your kin? Who are you related to? Your kinship connections are the primary identifier. So we have various flexible opportunities, and we have opportunities to reevaluate who we are, and that gets on another track. The ephemeralization of work creates a crisis. Again, it's this idea of being alienated from your labor. It was one thing when we were the laboring body, We're no longer that. Now we're turning over our intellects to AI. So then that creates a whole other identity crisis. So it's an interesting way to go. You're right, in terms of this being all embryonic. We don't know how it's coming out. Jeremy Rifkin addressed this. He talked about economies, the virtual economies versus economies of authenticity. And I think, again, we need to sort that out. And it'll be an interesting ride. You're right, we don't know what the outcome is. I'm expecting an interesting synthesis. That's that.
Indeed, and I think you're raising reinforcing the point of the importance of identity, authenticity, and those two being so closely connected to what you mentioned also earlier, Timothy, about meaning, and meaning being different than purpose, and that I think is also a fundamental opportunity. It is going to be a question mark across the board. What is our meaning with artificial intelligence? What is our meaning with a world that is driven more by work, by profit, by productivity? And we've got an opportunity to reflect on those. And again, our humble aim, and Bob always likes to refer to us as humble futurists, our humble aim was to try to bring these pretty weighty topics. Some might call them philosophical, some might call them esoteric, ephemeral, but they're so important because the world is in crisis now. And we really did try to apply foresight in a way that was going to be a user manual to help individuals, organizations, and communities to try to navigate through these shocks in order to begin designing or co-creating the kinds of solutions that we think are going to have more meaning, will fulfill a bigger purpose. That's also why we included the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a navigational star, to try to use that as a common framework that everyone ideally would say, as Bob always reminded all of us, I think, have clarity on where we are going, but flexibility about how we get there.
Yes, and thinking about that, Joseph, and of course, the conversation about the future of office, or you try to link that to the future of workplace and us, is not just about us. It's a good point that one of the chapters talks about nature as well, in the context of regeneration. Like, can offices create changes that are impactful, that enables us to create a more climate positive world, right? Can it actually reduce its emissions, these workplaces, right? We've seen the records of reports about how companies have polluted natural resources, and for not being inclusive about the conversation of growth. It was just too economic centric. But then, of course, we also have a conversation in the book about prosperity. Like, how do we exactly pursue prosperity that links the self, nature, and future generation? Can offices have that kind of conversation? And I think with this book, that emphasize the importance of perhaps in the corporate world now is about time to talk about regeneration as well.
Yeah, and again, our objective is to try to trigger those conversations, and I think this has been a wonderful example of that, and particularly within the Friends of Foresight and practitioners of foresight. These are the kinds of conversations that ideally we can all be having, so that we can achieve the impact that we all aim for, to create a better future, and to ideally work together as a community to be able to scale impact. If we're not able to do it, then I think it's going to be a real challenge, and that's where our opportunity to mobilize our collective expertise, our mindset, and our passion for creating better futures, for working and living for all. Nicole, I see we are at the top of the hour. And I want to thank everyone for the conversation. I want to thank you all for the opportunity. This is just exactly the kind of conversation and convening that we're hoping for, and would love to continue the conversation, to have another convening, and to keep the momentum, to mobilize ourselves for co-creating better futures. So thank you all.
You.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please subscribe to the APF newsletter if you'd like to keep updated for future events that we are going to have. And we hope to see you at the APF 20th anniversary in Dubai. Thank you so much for joining.